about your religion. I have to be careful about that one. I really don't. I'm not looking at where you've been and why you were there. I want to know where we are today and what we're going to do tomorrow. And here's what I think. And here's what my government thinks. Here's what the priorities are that we have. And here's what we're willing to put into it. And what do we do tomorrow? It's always a tough sell in any part of the world, but in the Arab world, perhaps particularly, to take that tact. But I did it with them. I did it with the Kurds as well in northern Iraq, which was great fun. That's another discussion. But David touched on a couple of the factors that really increased or really generated this violent extremism in a country that really you would not expect it otherwise. But I think a couple of the factors certainly were the recruitment by the CIA, by the U.S. government, by others, of mujahideen, Yemeni mujahideen, to fight in Afghanistan against the Russians in the 1980s. Many hundreds, thousands perhaps, of Yemenis were recruited in this effort and spent many, many years being trained in Afghanistan to defeat the Russians and throw out the infidels, if you will. When that war ended, many of them came back to Yemen. We're talking not a huge number here, probably in the small thousands, back to Yemen in the early 90s, right as Yemen is uniting, right as they're about to fight a civil war, into a situation where, they're fundamentally changed. Use the word fundamentally, but they are dramatically changed by their experience in Afghanistan, and they come back to a country where it's hard to find jobs, and they're in a fighting mood, if you will. They're easy to recruit. In then 1992, as Ambassador Newton mentioned, we've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands perhaps, of Yemenis being tossed out of Saudi Arabia, mostly, again, young men. Not all. Most of them, most of them having spent many, many years in Saudi Arabia. Indeed, some of them having been born in Saudi Arabia. So they bring back with them this Salafi philosophy. They bring back with them a more extreme, a radical Islam, and they don't have jobs either. So you've got, and then you have a few leaders, guys like Zindani, who are still around there, others who are there recruiting, building, and establishing an al-Qaeda presence in Yemen. Not under the radar. I think among the intelligence community, there was a knowledge that al-Qaeda in Yemen, which we didn't even call al-Qaeda in those days, but that there was a growing violent extremist group growing in Yemen as it was elsewhere. It really wasn't until 1997 and the attack on the two embassies in Nairobi and in Tanzania that we focused our attention on this Yemen connection. As the investigations into those attacks developed, a lot of the lines, people, equipment, other things went back to Yemen. That's when the FBI, CIA, others began to build a small presence, a larger presence in the intel community in Yemen, working more with Yemeni security, Yemeni intel, to take a look at this group, basically to try to track down those who planned the attacks on our embassy in our embassies in Africa. 2000, we have the attack on the USS Cole, a dramatic event that certainly attracts greater attention by the United States. Indeed, I just had I mentioned having breakfast with the Foreign Minister, Barbara Bodine, was at the breakfast as well, and she was there during the time of the Cole, and I think there have been movies made about this, but it was quite dramatic as we literally sent hundreds of FBI agents, investigators into Aden, into Yemen to investigate. And it was only then, I think, that Ali Abdullah Saleh's government began also to focus on the threat that al-Qaeda posed. Not so much in Yemen. There had been no threat against the government, no attacks in Yemen. President Saleh is a genius at balancing different constituencies, and I think he saw these groups and their tribal connections, whatever connections they had, as as a group he could deal with. He could negotiate with them. He could somehow balance them. They weren't posing a threat to him. They weren't posing a threat to his government. But we're the United States. We're big. We're very direct, demanding, and Ali Abdullah Saleh pays attention to this as well. And so we have a greater cooperation with Iraqi security, Yemeni security, and again, a beefing up of our presence, a dramatic increase in our presence on the ground in Yemen, focused primarily on finding, capturing, or killing the perpetrators of the attack on the USS Cole. 9/11, 2001, of course, is the seminal event for us. Just a sideline, I was the deputy director for what was called, in those days, the Office of Northern Gulf Affairs. I know Ambassador Mack and others are quite familiar with that office. It was also referred to as the Pariah State Office in NEA. I was very reluctant to take it. I had wanted a job on the Egypt desk instead, but they pushed me over and said, no, you take this job because you've just come out of Dubai for 4 years where our focus is on Iran. New administration, we're going to open to Iran, and we want you at State Department, you geniuses, to figure out how we, the new administration, the Bush administration, can increase our contacts with Iran with a notion of actually pushing things forward. Very positive. Okay, I took the job. A month later, the towers went down, the Pentagon was attacked, and our focus on Iran vanished. And I spent the next 2.5 years doing nothing but Iraq. And for Yemen, 9/11 was, again, a critical date. Vice President Cheney visited Yemen in December of 2001, and he basically delivered, as I'm sure Vice President Cheney is quite adept at doing, a rather blunt ultimatum to the government of Yemen. President Saleh reminded me of this a couple of times, as I would try to get tough with him, and he'd say, basically, I've dealt with Cheney. I'm not going to have a problem with you. But in fact, the vice president's point was, take a look at what's going on in Afghanistan. We're in a global war against terror. It's here in Yemen. Al-Qaeda is here in Yemen. And we're going to get it. We're going to get it with you, or we're going to get it without you. I would advise you to be with us. And Ali Abdullah Saleh, who is a very astute politician, and I do not mean that glibly. This is a guy who understands the way the world works. Shook hands with the vice president and said, we will be your strongest partners in this war. We will fight with you shoulder to, I'm quoting exactly here, we will fight with you shoulder to shoulder against these terrorists. And from that point, we saw a dramatic increase, not only in our presence actually was shrinking a little bit by then as the Cole investigations were wrapping up, beginning to wrap up, but we saw a exponential increase in our cooperation, intel, security with the Yemeni government and our own presence as well. I'm not going to go into the details of all of that, obviously, although some of it now is becoming public. I think the most public event of those next couple of years in our relationship was the targeted assassination of not Muhammad al-Houthi. What's Houthi? Is it Muhammad Houthi? Jamal.